All this week on The Perspective with Mike Sherbino and co-hosting for Julie Stoutland is Mitch Hunter. No one knows the difficulties of life more than Jesus. That's why he speaks about the mustard seed of faith. The kingdom of God, like the mustard seed, is growing. Carol McLeod is a best-selling author and speaker who says she's had days when she's been a blubbering mess, and others when she has been a stalwart warrior against the kingdom of darkness. The answer? Reaching out and asking God to increase our faith. And a fascinating conversation with Dr. Jeff Rhodes, who talks about the spiritual realm and dimensions. In these days of turmoil, the deaths of loved ones from COVID and other causes, so much uncertainty, Jeff assures us through scientific evidence and the Bible that heaven is always closer than we think. Plus, comedian turned pastor Thor Ramsey is not trying to keep up with the comedy Joses. Thor began in the clubs in the 80s and has been through a lot of changes. Ramsey says he simply loves Jesus and making people laugh. Well, he sure fits in well with Mike and Mitch.
Well, hey everybody, welcome to The Perspective. My name is Mitch Hunter. I'm co-hosting. This is Mike Sherbino. He is the head honcho today. And Mike, we're just having a bit of laugh before we started. And I'm looking forward. We've actually got a comedian on the show today.
Thor Ramsey.
Thor Ramsey. And so
Yeah.
He's a comedian. He's also a lead pastor. And
So you can do both.
it's possible. And you're showing it, and I'm clearly still learning about it. So, folks, honestly, welcome to the show. We've got a great show for you. Mike is going to be teaching on the whole subject of faith.
Yeah, so we want to pick it up today where we left off yesterday. I'm excited to do this teaching because it really is something that was born out of an experience through this past summer. As I shared with you several shows ago, I ended up spending several days in the hospital, 28 in total. Thought it was going to be one or two to get a little problem fixed up, but they couldn't do the frontal lobotomy. That's my sense of a joke that quickly. But anyways, as we unpack it, you know, what happened to me is I'd be on the elevator and it drove me really up the wall. The elevator would say going down or going up. And I didn't want to go down. I felt just overwhelmed. I thought, what does it mean to go up? And you see, we are a people that are looking for hope. We desperately want hope. And how do we find hope in the dark crevices of life? Whether it's a hospital, a financial crisis, maybe it's a marriage that is breaking up. I don't know what your situation is today, but I do know that as we were talking yesterday on the program, God calls us to trust. And he called Abraham to trust radically. And if you remember, we're unpacking Genesis chapter 22. It's that passage where God tells Abraham at roughly the age of 115, I want you to sacrifice your son Isaac. Isaac's a 15, 16-year-old. He could have easily whipped the old man, but he walks along in subjection with his father. And Abraham says, we are going to sacrifice and make a sacrifice. And here's what he says to his men. After he's cut the firewood, after he's heard God call him to say, I want you to go to the land of Moriah. And Moriah, by the way, the Mount Moriah, it's about 2,500 square feet, 2,500 feet rather, not square feet, 2,500 feet in the air. It's not a huge mountain, but it's the place that we think where Christ was crucified 2,000 years later. So it's an incredible connection. It's where the Temple Mount is. It's right in the heart of Jerusalem today. And here God is calling Abraham to sacrifice what is most closest to his heart, his son, the son of promise, the son through whom the nations would be blessed. And Abraham, for the 3 days as they walked to Moriah, he had to be racking his brain, plus choking back the tears. He's saying, God, I'm going to be obedient to you, but how is this going to work? Now, he knew that Isaac was a miracle child because he was almost 100 and Sarah was 90 when the baby was born. Folks, you know what? Just go back to grade 9 health and you know that that's a miracle. But he comes along and says, God, I'm going to trust you. And we read this powerful phrase. Abraham says to the young men that are with him, stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there, speaking to the mount. We are going to worship and come back again to you. You see, worship calls for radical surrender and obedience. And somehow Abraham, he didn't know how it was all going to work out, but he knew that if he killed his son, which was a detestable practice, he's trying to understand why God would call him to do something that only the pagans did. And sometimes we don't understand God's ways. But the key phrase, of course, is God came to test his faith. Satan comes to tempt us to turn from God. God calls us to obey him. You know, what prepared Abraham for this moment? Later on in the program, I'm going to come back and I'm going to unpack the test itself. But let's just think quickly. There are 5 things that I wanted to share with you. First of all, God gave Abraham years before a promise that through him, he would bless the nations of the earth. So he knew that Isaac played a big part of that. That's in Genesis chapter 12. There's one day his nephew Lot was rebellious, and he got captured by 4 armies. And in faith, Abraham said, I'm going to go fight for my family. It takes 318 men, and he captures Lot, and he defeats those 4 armies. That's a miracle. And then there was when the 3 visitors came in Genesis 18 and said to Abraham, you're going to have a son. And Sarah laughed, but they said, nothing is impossible with God. And once again, in Genesis 19, there's the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah for their sexual sin. But Abraham interceded, and he said, God, if there's 50 people, you destroy it. And God said, no. And he walked right down to 10 people. But at the end, he goes and he brings out Lot and his family because family is important to him. And then ultimately, there is the birth of Isaac. We're going to look at that in just a moment. But those 5 things prepared Abraham for what was going to happen next. And perhaps in your life right now, as you're facing a great test, you need to think back and say, how has God prepared me for this moment right now? Well, welcome back to The Perspective, folks. Our next guest is proud of his squeaky clean, get this, square image in the Christian comedy realm. Is that an oxymoron? Thor Ramsey. Thor, welcome to The Perspective. Tell us how you made
it's good to be here.
Yeah, well, tell us how you made the journey from comedian in the clubs in the 80s to being a pastor, because I'd like to think that I'm a comedian and I always wanted to be a late night comedy host. So what's the key?
Well, the first thing you got to do, Mike, is stop getting your jokes off the internet. That's number one. That's the number one rule to make that transition.
What about Google? What about Google?
Google. Well, okay, that Google's on the internet. Mike, I don't know if anyone's gone over this with you. Mitch, you're
so many
younger
jokes I can
version.
make right now. Yeah, I'm just leaving it alone.
Yeah, maybe you could like take a day, have lunch, explain how the internet and everything works.
I'll help him out.
Like help him so we can, maybe Mike go old school. Just get a notebook and start writing things down. Just do it that way.
I can't write.
Hire someone who does shorthand or something.
Hey, but seriously, what inside you made you want to make people laugh?
That you can't answer. What inside you? Because I remember being like a 5-year-old kid, and I would sneak downstairs. My dad was a late nighter, so I'd sneak downstairs after my mom had put me to bed and crawl up on his lap, and he'd be watching The Tonight Show, the old version with Johnny Carson. And I still remember when he'd introduced comedians. And I didn't really understand what was happening, but there was something about this guy came out and the spotlight was on him, and there was this crowd out there that you couldn't see laughing at him. And this, people talk about falling in love with a theater. They're like, well, I never did that, but I did fall in love with. I just fell in love with that idea of stand-up. For some reason, it always appealed to me. And then throughout grade school, I became the class clown, and I think a lot of people find comedy really what it becomes, comedy becomes a way of you avoid getting beat up is really what happens a lot of times. If you can make someone laugh, maybe they won't beat you up, or they won't hit you as hard. It's kind of, they kind of give you a little, they'll still beat you up, but they won't hit you as hard because you made them laugh a little bit. But so it becomes a coping mechanism. And then comedy really is a form of criticism.
Interesting. Explain that. Explain that.
Well, there's different ways of criticizing culture, or there's different ways of criticizing things in the world that you're unhappy with. And many comedians had unhappy childhoods, not all of them, but it's a way of, going through that. And it's a way of voicing your dissatisfaction with the way things are going and really pointing it out. But instead of pointing it out in a straightforward manner, the way, you would do as a preacher, you point it out in sometimes satirical ways, or just in ways that, might poke fun at it. So it's a form of criticism that way, always has been. So I think now what's sad today is that comedians can't say because there's an old rule in comedy that the comedian says what everyone is thinking but is afraid to say. And that's been the job or the role of the comedian.
We got these two big words, cancel culture, and we're afraid.
Cancel culture. So
Yeah.
comedians now are afraid to say what they're actually thinking, which, like, how does comedy work in that? Well, then you end up with, which I don't think the programs are as funny as they used to be. Even the late night show, which I don't watch the late night shows anymore. I've really stopped watching, and you can blame this on the internet, Mike. This goes back to that thing called the internet.
I've heard about it. Yeah.
But on the internet, you have, like, all the streaming stuff now. You have Apple TV, Netflix, Amazon. I rarely watch anything that's commercial television.
And just for the record,
Yes.
I'm too young to know who Johnny Carson is. Okay, but anyway, Mitch has a question. Mitch, you're itching to say something.
Yeah, Thor, what I'm wondering is, I could see you love comedy, and I hope we get to talk about it more, but I'm wondering, you moved from doing comedy in nightclubs, that sort of thing, and now you are a lead pastor. And how does that work? How did that transition come about? How did you know you should become a pastor?
Well, that's something you just know that you can't explain either. It's almost like explaining why you're attracted to comedy or the arts or anything else. But so I was playing clubs, and then I got married, which I understand, Mitch, you're about to get married, and I'll give you some advice there. But I got married. I wasn't walking with the Lord at the time when I was doing comedy in clubs. And I got married, and I was like, I needed help to stay married is really what it was. Like, I'm not going to make it alone. And I had enough experience with historic Christianity to know that there's only one person I know who can give me power that I don't have, and that's the God who created all things. And so I looked to Jesus, and that transformed my life, transformed my marriage, and soon I found myself. I didn't even know there was such a thing as Christian comedy. I was just doing stand-up, but so I basically. Long story short, my first events were in prisons. And so I went from doing clubs I went from doing basically one-nighters, which is bars. So I went from bars to clubs to prison. And that's how God prepares you for youth events right there. So God prepared me for youth events, and I was able to move into the Christian market. And, that's kind of how I ended up here.
Hey, Thor, we're going to ask you to hang with us. We're going to be right back to talk to you more about how comedy intersects your life and your life as a pastor. So stay with us. We'll be right back with Thor Ramsey.
The global youth culture. More connected, but never more alone. Always seeking pleasure, but never satisfied. A worldwide suicide epidemic. Sexually broken and confused, raised on pornography, taught there is no absolute truth, only preference. How do we communicate the gospel to these young people who have such a negative view of God? How can we show them the love of Jesus in a language they'll understand? In Steiger, our heart is to bridge the gap between the church and the global youth culture. We do this by raising up missionaries and equipping the local church to proclaim the message of Jesus in a relevant way to culture today. Our vision is to establish 100 city teams by 2025, reaching 1 million global youth every year.
Well, hey, welcome back, everybody. And with us today is Thor Ramsey, a comedian and a lead pastor. And how do you even stick those two together? We've been talking about that before. But Thor, let me just jump right in and ask you this. You are passionate and you are talented at Christian comedy. When I think about making Christian comedy, I say, man, is that going to be boring? Are people going to watch? What sort of topics are you able to have fun with in Christian comedy to make people laugh?
Well, comedy's comedy. First of all, it doesn't change from the secular market to the Christian market. The only thing that changes is your worldview. So the only thing that changed when I went from the secular market to the Christian market was my worldview and the way that I presented my jokes. Now, some jokes are, there's a thing called common grace. So whether a person's a Christian or not, there's certain things we can talk about. We can talk about parenting. We can talk about our married life. We can talk about, buying a car. We can talk about the trouble with, customer service in the country today. There's a lot of things you can talk about that are crossover in terms of they're just common ground topics. And so a secular comic, so to speak, or a Christian comic can talk about all those same things. And a lot of times even from the same point of view, that there's a problem with them all in one sense. I mean, I could talk about, I'll give you this, because my wife and I just celebrated 29 years of marriage a couple weeks ago. We've been married for 29. Yeah. I don't know what, you don't know her, so I don't know why you're congratulating me. But the point is this. So my wife came to me and she said, in 29 years of marriage, I've never thought of leaving you once. I fantasized about your death a few times, never thought of leaving you. See? And then I explained to her, it's like, and this is true, I would not be the man I am today without my wife, because suffering produces perseverance, you get the idea. But the point is this, the thing I found is that my wife, so we went to a marriage seminar, and I discovered that people who are happily married should not be teaching marriage seminars. That's who should not be teaching them, because we ended up with this guy. It was like, my wife and I've been married for, 35 years. I love her today more than the day I married her. I'm like, I'm happy for you, but shut up about that, because you're making the rest of us look bad. All right, I'm with the marriage union. Don't work so hard, because we get paid the same. But the point is that now you can talk about all that stuff and poke fun at marriage, but that will work whether you're in a Christian crowd or a secular crowd. So comedy doesn't have to do with really in one sense. Well, it's all about point of view is really what comedy's about.
Hey, Thor, can I jump in? Do you mind? I got to test a joke on you. This is my favorite Christian joke, not an original, but let me ask you. Let me spin this, and you and Mike can judge. Yeah. So God, I'm just going to try it. So God created Adam, and he called him man. You say, well, what did he call Eve? Well, he created the woman, and then when Adam saw her, he said, "Whoa, man."
Yeah, no, I actually heard. So get this.
Did you get that off the internet, Mitch?
That wasn't mine. I saw it one time.
When I started comedy in 1987 in clubs, I heard non-Christian secular comics do that joke.
Okay, so it's older than me. It's like years older.
But that tells you how much society's changed, though.
Very interesting. So Thor, let's unpack this together. Yeah, we're talking over each other, and that's because I got some funny things I want to say, but I'm going to pass on it. Let's just pick up a little bit on the whole thing of cancel culture, and not just as a comedian, but as a pastor. How does that impact what you talk about? And bring us back to that whole point of how it is you're communicating in your church as you trust God to see lives changed.
Well, I don't think cancel culture should affect the Christian. I think Christians push back against cancel culture because we are people of the book, because we are people of the truth, and the book is God's truth revealed to humanity. And so when you're convinced of that, we're not going from a perspective of, hey, how acceptable is this going to be? Now, we don't want to add our personalities and make something that's unpalatable even more unpalatable because of our obnoxious personalities. But we can't be afraid to speak the truth in love and gentleness and kindness. And that's what we're called to do. And oddly, in one sense, historically, that's what comedians have done all throughout culture. There's a reason that you could say disenfranchised groups have always led the way in comedy. If you look historically at comedy, when you look at how Jewish people have really excelled in comedy throughout the years, well, because the Jews were always a disenfranchised, persecuted group. And so you take these groups, and comedy's a way, again, of coping with these things and criticizing the larger culture around them in a way that the culture might actually hear what they're saying, because it's one thing to say it in a humorous way where you disarm someone. It's another way to take the activistic, let's blow everything up and burn down buildings type of way, which doesn't seem to, garner as much public support, oddly enough, depending upon what you're today, who knows? But the point is this, but even the black community also very much have excelled at comedy through the years, because now you have another disenfranchised group. Like, it's like you can't find a lot of Nazi comedians throughout history, because again, it's the idea of the disenfranchised groups. They're finding a way to cope and to do that. Now, the point is this: they're trying to speak truth to power. And that's what Christians are doing, because we've always been a minority group. Even when people say, well, Christians have always been the majority, it's like, we haven't. And true biblical Christianity has never been the majority. Even when Christianity itself was a majority, what was the issue even back, if you go to the 1970s with the Jesus movement, the reason the Jesus movement, well, and which I believe was a true move of God. Now, I didn't experience it, but from what I understand historically, the point being is that the ministry of the gospel was going to people in churches. It was people in churches who were coming to know Christ. Excuse me, not the outside culture. And so the point is this: Christians are people of the truth. We've always been the minority, but it's been our job, and it still is our job, to speak truth to power. And that power is really the powers of darkness that, manifest themselves in this world today. Now, the world doesn't see it that way, but cancel culture shouldn't affect us, is
Thor,
the point.
I want to jump in. You've made some profound comments. I want to thank you. Our time is up. And
it's just my way.
I just want to encourage people to track with you, follow you. Thor Ramsey, comedian, pastor. And someday I want to come down and open up for you. Okay? Thanks for being with us.
My pleasure.
Well, welcome back, everybody. We've just come out of our time with Thor Ramsey. And can I just encourage you, you're hanging out at home, can I encourage you to go check out Thor Ramsey's book? It's called The End Times Comedy Show. And you can find that on Amazon, your local non-Christian bookstore. The End Times Comedy Show by Thor Ramsey. Go over, check that out.
It's going to be a good read.
I'm sure we'll have some laughs.
I just enjoyed the conversation so much. We could have gone sideways on a lot of things because he just is a funny guy. And, Mitch, it says that laughter is a good medicine. And sometimes maybe we got too much starch in our shorts.
It happens.
We're just not laughing enough. But, there's another part of laughter, because life is serious, but we can still walk in God's joy. And we can learn to see that there are so many different things that God has given us to enjoy.
Absolutely. And I believe that it is one of the gifts of God that we're able, even in the midst of life's tough, trying circumstances, or thinking about Abraham being tested, even in those moments that are difficult for us, God says we can experience his joy. And I believe part of that is laughter, of course, but going back, we have the joy of the Lord.
And joy is so important. I can't help but imagine Jesus and Peter. I was talking about Peter last week, and I can just see them on the boat, and sometimes maybe they pushed each other in. Who knows what happened? We fail to see that side, the humanity of our Lord when he was here on earth, and just how he interchanged.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, of course, I'm so excited by, think of the joy of the Lord. I'm thinking even the gift of comedy that God has given to us, and I'm excited talking with Thor that we are able to enjoy that comedy, and we could do it in a way that isn't offensive. We don't have to say all sorts of terrible things, that we can laugh, and that's a gift from God. So hey, everybody, stay with us. Up next is Mike's Teach.
Well, the reality of the text that we're looking at today is that Abraham was not dealing with a laughing matter. There was no comedian that could lighten his heart at this point, except for the promises of God. Here he is being called to sacrifice his son Isaac, who he deeply loved. Was there smiles when the child was born? Absolutely. It had to be the talk of the town. But suddenly the joy that he had, and maybe Abraham, he didn't teach him to ride a bicycle, but he probably taught him to ride a camel, to race a camel, and all those good things. The memories are flooding through. They're walking to Mount Moriah. They're with their men, and Abraham makes a statement, I and the boy will go over there and worship, and will come again to you. Why did God test Abraham this way? I believe that the simplest way for us to understand this passage is to realize that God tests each of us with the thing or the person that we love the most. Will we surrender that to him and discover that even in that act of surrender, that the Lord is more than enough? And I believe that's where Abraham was being taken. And that's why we can refer to him as the great granddaddy of faith. But let's look at a couple things. When God spoke to him in verse 1, he said, "Here I am." And at the moment when he was about to kill his son, the angel called out and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." He says, "Don't lay a hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God." But I think the beauty of the passage is simply this. There was so much that Abraham didn't understand, but he knew that he could trust in the promises of God. And part of the promise was found in Genesis 17, where it was told that he would establish a covenant with Isaac, whom Sarah would bear to him in a year's time. And so as he's pondering all those things, he's saying, somehow God is going to do another miracle. It was a miracle that Isaac was born. He said he will be resurrected. And so when Abraham hears this, he responds. I believe for the 3 days as they're walking, he's choking back tears. He's struggling with things, but he obeys. And that's where God calls you and I to go. So how does faith operate? You see, faith in God is what gives us the strength to press on and something to hold on to. We need to hold on to him. I can't hold on to my own self-assurance. I can't hold on to the promises of other people. But faith draws upon the promises of God. In Isaiah 66, verse 11, those promises are called the breasts of consolation. Just like a baby finds comfort at the mother's breast, so the scripture says you and I are to find comfort in the promises of God. And that's what Abraham was doing. He knew the promises of God, that this was the child of promise. And then what we read in Jeremiah 15, verse 16, it says, Jeremiah said, your words were found to me, and I ate them, and they gave me life. Faith makes the promises of God food for the soul. It's what he had to be rehearsing over and over again. I don't know about you, but when I've gone through some very dark times, and I had to go through a very dark time recently, what I relied on were the promises of God. The moment I didn't, I just was overwhelmed and I wanted to crash. But when I started to rehearse the promises of God and give thanks to him in the midst of what I was going through, I discovered that the elevator was going up. I discovered that my joy level would increase, even though on the outward circumstances, I didn't understand it. You see, faith is not believing that God can, but that he will. And faith sees the invisible, it believes the incredible, and receives the impossible. And then what I love about this is that faith takes the promises of God and turns it into power. That's why Paul wrote in Philippians chapter 4, verse 13, I can do all things through Christ who gives me the strength. And today I want to invite you to surrender your life to Christ. You might feel like you're being tested, going through a difficult time, but I want you to know that God is with you. He will never fail you or forsake you. He loves you. He wants to be as close to you as he was to Abraham, and he will be there, a friend who sticks closer than a brother. Invite him today to be your Savior and your Lord.